All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to the next in our series, How Do We Go Forward, How Do We Go Back? This week we are talking about writing and publishing, and I am delighted to welcome our two guests, Zane McNeill and Dr. William Horne. Zane McNeill is a queer theorist currently editing collections on socially engaged art, choreopolitics, queer ecologies, soundscapes, and Appalachian studies. And Dr. William Horne is a historian of 19th century US racial capitalism, co-founder and editor of the Activist History Review, and a postdoctoral fellow at Villanova University. Thank you really both for joining us this evening. How are things going for you? Where are you at?
It's certainly been a mix of everything, I think. I think we'll agree, but excited to be here. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for having me here. I'm super excited to be here, and I apologize in advance if my very loud kids come in a minute. But we'll make it work. It'll be very exciting. Yeah.
All right. If you don't mind, I'll start the ball rolling with just one question, and then you guys can either talk freely or ask some more things. So the first thing I want to ask is, like, since pandemic started, how has your writing practice changed? Because I know both of you are prolific writers.
Will, do you want to jump on that one first?
Sure, absolutely. My situation, I guess, is complicated not only by what we're all dealing with in terms of the pandemic and the stress that's associated with that, and the activist work that many of us do, related to that. But I also am sort of the primary caregiver right now for our three kids with my partner. And so most of my day, every single day, is, making food and changing diapers and stuff, which is great work, but it's a lot of work. And so I'm very used to writing a lot, especially when, I'm, I don't know, moved by what's happening as I am now, and I have this piece that I'm sitting on right now, and I'm sort of kicking myself for not figuring out a way to make time for it. But of course that's not possible, my kids deserve to be taken care of. So yeah, it's, for me, my writing practice has slowed substantially. But, I keep sort of reminding myself that this is, really kind of an unprecedented time, an event that we're going through. But it is a bit of a downer.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, we're so used to our productivity being integral to who we are, right? I think that's, at least personally for me, if I'm not producing a lot, I feel like I'm not doing enough. And so when the pandemic hit, actually, I was really excited because I'm an independent scholar, so I work full time. And so I was in between jobs and about a month and a half, and I was like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and get so much writing done. I'm going to get so ahead and actually meet my deadlines. And then COVID hit, and I'm very much so a coffee shop writer, first of all. So I had to relearn how to even be in a right headspace to do it, which took about a month. But also I think a lot of what we all faced is that fear around the pandemic, the isolation, and so my mental health wasn't as stable either. And so that also made it very difficult to actually get down and write. And then I finally was able to start back on it. And then the uprisings have been occurring. And so it's very hard to write when your Facebook is full of your friends' images of their wounds of being hit with rubber bullets and tear canisters. And seeing that every day makes it very difficult for me to concentrate.
Right. Yeah, and for me, I think there's a lot of organizing that goes along with that, and so you're sort of prioritizing, I brought my kids to a protest, and then, I've been doing sort of organizing work a bit after bedtime and stuff like that. But there's a lot of juggling, and I just sort of keep thinking about how this, for some folks out there, is like really like their everyday, you know. I mean, in many ways, like I feel a bit guilty because like I'm complaining about not having enough time to write, but like this is an extremely privileged problem to have, right? You know, and that's part of what drives me right now to, when I can, you know, devote my energies, you know, elsewhere to some sort of concrete action. But it is an astonishing time to be doing this kind of work that we're doing.
And something that's been difficult for me is trying to find the right balance between like analyzing the situation, as I think activist scholars and scholars in particular are apt to do. Like I want to, like especially thinking about Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police, the socially engaged art project in DC, I want to use my theories and my framework of, you know, socially engaged art and choreopolitics to think about that. And so the first thing I want to do instinctively is just write it down, right? But I think that that really isn't the best use of my time, especially when you can be instead uplifting voices of color. So it's been interesting for me to think of how much, at this point, archiving isn't as important to me and writing isn't as important to me as trying to use my skills to maybe do grant writing or uplift other Black scholars, queer, trans, people of color, doing the work and
Right.
not taking space in that.
Yeah.
All right. And I know that as well as both of you being writers, you co-edited a journal, and I know that you're both going to press with certain things. I'd love to cover both of those things, but I don't know if you would like to talk about editing or publication first. So I'll leave that to you.
I guess let's jump on editing
I
first,
agree.
since all three of us have that in common.
Right. Yeah, you know, we alternate the issues that we edit at the Activist History Review. And so I'm editing one right now. And it's extremely difficult for me to find the time to edit. But it's also, I've noticed a lot of our scholars and contributors struggle as well to send things in, you know, and to make revisions and things like that. And, you know, I'm just reminded of how, you know, we hear a lot, I think, in the news about, you know, the virus itself, right, or closures or the effects, or the uprisings, right. But I think we, you know, really don't talk enough about the effects on our work. And so like I ran the numbers for the few issues that we've had since the pandemic. And we have like about a 5% like attrition rate before. It's a little less than that, but before the pandemic, which means like about 5% of contributors, once they're accepted for whatever reason, and there are many like legitimate reasons, just, you know, are unable to follow through. And since the pandemic, it's been 50%, so 10 times higher than that. And so I think that really gives a very clear sense of just how much all of us who are doing this work are struggling right now.
Yeah, one thing, I was really excited for a piece I've been thinking about since October on the Anthropocene. And finally we get the call for participation. It was going to be an issue in March. And then obviously COVID hit. And that really just pushed everything back. And then even though we had folks who still engaged with it, you could really tell in all of our work that we were influenced and it hit hard by the issues we all face and the changing in work styles and then the fear around that. And so it was something very visible compared to the other issues I've edited previously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I interrupt for a second and ask you both to talk about how you manage that from an editorial perspective, or how you'd like to see other journals managing that? Like how do you roll with it? Do you cancel things? Like, what do you do in that if that's going on?
That's a really great question. Zane, would you want to jump in first, since, you know, you have the
I don't
specific
know if
issue?
I have the right answer. With my issue, it was unfortunate because we worked with these folks for multiple rounds of revisions, and like I put my own personal labor into it and they put a ton of labor into it also, and the work product just wasn't where we are used to at the Activist History Review. And so we had to make a lot of difficult decisions about what was going to get posted or what wasn't going to get posted. And so I don't know if we have the right answer. At that point, we just kind of took the cut in pieces. but it was really disappointing for me because I have more folks. I had like 50 people who were interested, you know, when I posted about it in October. And then when the CFP came out and then COVID hit, it really didn't come out the way I wanted it to. And so I don't really know how we are trying to change the editorial process right now. Do you want to jump on that, Will?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've talked about a few things, and honestly, we're just sort of trying to see what works. And so we've talked about doing shorter issues, both because all of our editors are dealing with, you know, a more difficult work environment, but also, you know, trying to be in touch with contributors more and sort of explicitly name what's happening right now. And that, you know, it's okay, you know, if your work isn't where you feel you want it to be. And also if you just need help, you know, or just need to talk through stuff, we can do that. And so, you know, we had planned to take fewer submissions for this June issue on resisting white supremacist militancy. And we wound up deciding, because there were so many, and again, this is something totally unplanned, right? The uprisings happened like after we had already scheduled the issue, you know? And so like we're dealing with massive white supremacist violence right now, right? And so we're like trying to think through, all right, like this is sort of like an emergency, you know, can some of these pieces help speak to that and help us think through how to respond? And so we wound up accepting way more than we should have. But, you know, they were all great, you know, and they, you know, hopefully they'll all, you know, come out over the next couple weeks. But, you know, I think it shows how we're all kind of trying to figure things out as we go right now. And, you know, I mean, especially with the uprisings, like I just, you know, Daryl Walker and I, you know, we're co-editing this one. We both agreed it's just impossible to turn these down right now. They all seem very distressingly relevant.
Yeah, and for comparison, I did the May issue on recovering queer histories in unexpected places last year. And we ended up having like 20 different folks who sent in really great submissions. So it turned into a double issue. So that's kind of what I was used to working with. And then being able to put out 4 pieces instead in March, which I think really shows how we're all facing a lot of issues right now. And I think that's reflected in publishing and editing all over, everywhere. It's been not just supply chain issues, but just product.
Right. Yeah, I'm really, you know, in some ways interested to see what happens with sort of university presses and you might say sort of the peer-reviewed model. I don't think that it's going away entirely, but there is a bit of it that feels unsustainable, both in terms of finding reviewers. We're hearing a lot of that right now, that there just aren't reviewers available. But, you know, also in terms of the costs associated with that model of publishing, especially the university press monograph market, you know, that's really, I don't know how that continues in the form that it has. And so it will be, I think, really interesting to see, and some really good things could come out of that. You know, we could see a more democratized and transparent publication process. I think that would be really good for minoritized scholars and, you know, that sort of thing. But it's so hard to know, you know. And I think generally, you know, when we see more scarce resources, those groups tend to be more hurt than not, you know. And so that's something, I don't know, I'm watching very closely. I imagine y'all are as well.
And this is anecdotal, but I just heard lots of my friends having their retained, you know, contracts ended up going away when COVID hit, right? Because it's expensive to publish this. But I mean, the peer review process takes so long. So they could have been working on, like I had one friend who's been working on their collection for 2 years. Yeah. And then they had their contract dissolved in April. Wow. And not because of any interaction with the peer review, but just because people or the presses are having to cut so many different projects that they were really excited about, but the finances just really aren't there, and especially issues with the supply chain in general, and people aren't buying as much books, and so it's all really convoluted right now.
Well, and the edited volume as a form itself doesn't make much money, really. It loses money most of the time, right? And so, those are sort of the first ones to get cut. So it'll be fun to work through that project with you, Zane, and see how that impacts that work. I think it will still be a really exciting project. We managed to, work in a few chapters from our COVID issue where folks are
You want to
sharing their
introduce that,
COVID.
Will, for folks who don't know what we're working on? Do
I'm sorry?
you want to introduce that?
Oh, yeah. So we're working on two collections of essays right now. One that is sort of, you might say, more closely related to higher ed labor, and then one that is more closely related to sort of using scholarship as a way to understand oppression and responses to it in the present. And so we're working on both of those simultaneously. The higher ed one is a little bit closer to being done.
Yeah, and that's something that I really started pushing for once I started on the editorial board, thinking about activist scholarship, and something really important to me is archiving marginalized voices. And that's one reason I think anthologies are such a great way to uplift those historically oppressed folks. And so we've been trying to figure out really what to do. But as an activist scholar, right, you're in between the lines of academic publishing. So not being academic enough for academic publishing, and then being too academic for popular writing. And so that's one issue, I think, of trying to make something accessible and then trying to work in academia as an inside out kind of scholar in general. Yeah,
that's been a really interesting thing to experience. I don't know. I have lots of thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a whole other conversation.
Maybe they're for later. Yeah, but I did wind up just sort of committing to myself that while this the pandemic and now the uprisings are going on, that I'm just not going to worry about academic publishing right now. I think our talents are much better suited to helping us as a collective navigate these crises in a way that is equitable and just.
Yeah, one of the projects I've been working on now since I think 2018 is on Queer Appalachia, really inspired from the zine that came out in 2017 that Gina Mamone really championed, and they do obviously great work for really everything. If you're not aware of Queer Appalachia, you can follow them on Facebook and Instagram. But one of the things they did, because they do a lot of work with mutual aid and harm reduction, which in West Virginia, there's not a lot of spaces for like needle exchanges or obviously like having accessible Narcan or Plan B. And so they work a lot on that. They just got a really great grant for that in spring, and then COVID hit. And so one of the things they did was go into Southern West Virginia and give free COVID testing and then house homeless sex worker populations in hotels to make sure they were safe because they couldn't work for those 2 weeks, right? To make sure they were safe while they waited for the results. And so even though I've been working on this book and had all the chapters done pretty much as the whole manuscript was finished, like that's a story that I think really should be told as queer organizing in Appalachia. And then thinking about the uprising, what's been going on in Richmond and Asheville, right? So there's a lot of stories as time progresses, right, that I think should be included in this collection. And that's something I feel very lucky. I'm working with PM Press, and just like everyone else, they're facing issues, but they're keeping on all their projects. They applied for different grants and loans to be able to make sure that the products they have, which there's an activist kind of publisher, get to the folks they believe should get it. And so we're working together to try to archive these stories as well as things unfold.
I will just jump in for a minute and say that despite how difficult everything has been, I do know that, Zane, you have just brought out a book in the midst of everything that's been going on. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Secondly, what was that like? How has that been working with the press to bring out a new book in the middle of everything that's been happening?
Well, our project, Queer and Trans Voices, was actually always kind of interesting because I don't know if everyone knows Sanctuary Publishers, but they're pretty much a one-person show. All the proceeds go to queer and trans, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color. And so it really is a community effort, and it's a community book project. And so both Julia Feliz and I were co-editors. Julia Feliz is the head of the publishing company, and then we both are very much propelled by anxiety to an extent. And so I reached out to them last April, and it was published this April, which is an amazingly fast turnaround for publishing, especially as someone who's worked in academic publishing, right? A 1-year turnaround is just mind-boggling for me. But yeah, I've never actually gone through a marketing, and I'm much more involved in marketing than I anticipated. But marketing during COVID is a whole other ball field, I feel like. And so it's been really interesting because I've been really reaching out to obviously magazines and everything, and we've been doing video conferencing. We're doing a virtual book tour. And so it's kind of fun to see how marketing and author talks has changed and evolved with the pandemic, because this is something I think we're probably looking at for another year or two. So we have to figure out what to do with that.
What have people been doing?
For different events?
Yeah, what have you seen that's worked?
I think one, again, talking about Asheville, Firestorm, which is a queer anarchist co-op and bookstore, they've been having virtual events. Red Emma's up in Baltimore, same kind of thing. They've been doing that. And it's really been another way to build community in addition to having author talks. And I mean, most of these different bookstores would usually have probably like 7 or 10 people come in and sit down. So they actually have a larger reach by doing it online and virtual. And then especially since we're all kind of living socially distant lives, it is nice to try to build community through social media as well, in addition to the virtual spaces for like book talks and everything, like Zoom. Because in addition to that, you can also, have the discussion board, add each other on Facebook, and build off that as well.
And Will, I know that you've also had an article recently come out in The Nation. How was that experience for you, getting that out?
Yeah, and I mean that's been wild and very exciting, obviously. And so the piece is on how we should think about paying for education going forward, keeping in mind equity, justice, things like that. And so we wrote it. Alyssa Bowen and I co-authored it about a month ago, so before the uprisings began. And so that really had not been part of our frame of reference. And so we wanted to really, right before it was published, sort of think through, how those impact how we have that conversation. I think in terms of the policy, it's sort of similar, in that really we shouldn't be looking to, individual students in debt or, private donors and things like that to fund higher education. That's incredibly unstable, incredibly unjust, and incredibly shady, honestly. Where is this money coming from, and what strings are these people pulling? It's there are stories, but anyway, so the policy part of it was sort of the same, but I think it's really important to speak to what people are experiencing in the moment, and so I was really grateful that they let us sort of tweak what we wrote and how we described it. I think it's really important.
Fantastic. Any roundup thoughts before I open you up to questions? Especially when we think about returning to academia in the fall, and a lot of people are going back into writing, publishing, tenure, trying to get things out. Like, what advice would you give people? Like, what policies would you like to see people follow?
Well, Will can answer the end of that question since I mostly work as an independent scholar and activist. But one thing I think about with publishing, we just don't really know what's going to happen yet, because I don't think the different publishing companies have quite figured out what to do. I think they're trying to rethink their whole supply chain, and they don't know how long this is going to last. And so I feel like every different publisher is reacting in different ways. So I was saying I felt really lucky that PM Press is holding all of their folks. But again, like Academic Publishing, Illinois Press, WVU Press are cutting collections that they've worked on. I had one piece that's been under peer review for about 10 months, and they said they couldn't offer an advanced contract until they get the whole manuscript, partially because of the pandemic and not knowing really how to budget with that. And so I think one thing that I've been trying to do is, and I know it's not something we can all do, but I've been trying to write a lot of short pieces to get out as quickly as possible, about things that I care about, and then uplifting, again, different voices that might not, since I have a slightly larger platform than some folks. And so when you're thinking about writing and publishing, like we were saying before, sometimes it feels like you can't do it, you're so exhausted, and sometimes it doesn't feel like it's the right thing to do. And so I think recognizing that, especially if you're an independent scholar like me and you have the space to do that and step back, trying to figure out what else you can do to really help a movement and help other folks is important. You're allowed to take a break, because I know that's something I struggle with. Like, you're allowed not to write for a day or two, for sure.
Yeah. You know, the academic publishing and tenure part of the question, I guess, sort of struck a nerve for me, because you know, I have so many friends who do this work, you know, and most of them don't have like a full-time gig now, right? You know, they're at best, you know, a lot of my VAP, you know, visiting professor friends are now adjuncting, which means they're teaching 1 or 2 classes now, just kind of trying to scrape by. And it just sort of reminds me of the dramatically changing landscape, labor landscape in higher ed. All of us, almost all of us, are just sort of one arbitrary decision or one budget line item from being in that exact same boat, you know. And so what I tell, you know, people who I talk to, you know, it's just, you know, don't publish for tenure, right? Like publish to fix the problem that's, you know, it's burning down the house that we're trying to get tenure in. You know, and that's been my philosophy. I don't know if that's smart, but I just, you know, if higher education vanishes, you know, as some of the predictions, you know, suggest, then, you know, that all of that, you know, peer-reviewed and academic stuff that's going to be read by a dozen or 2 dozen people, maybe isn't the best use of our time. And that's not to say that that doesn't have a place, you know, that it's not worthwhile, but, you know, that we really need to think about systems of equity, justice, and sustainability now in the present in higher ed.
I'm so glad I asked that last question. Thank you. And I think don't publish for your tenure, publish to fix the problem that's burning down the house we're trying to get tenure in is going down as my tagline, possibly, for this particular episode. All right, I am going to open it now back up to our guests who have been waiting very patiently. So folks, if you are non-camera, you are now more than welcome to join us, or you may unmute your audio, post questions in chat. This is a more open discussion. You are more than welcome. Before I take the first question, though, please can we all just thank Zane and Will for all of their work tonight and all that they've done.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, here we are.
I have just kind of a generic question. I don't know if that, especially since you both kind of straddle 2 different sorts of um, inhabitations of academic writing, what advice or like suggestions or pathways do you have for students in particular who are interested in getting into writing? Because I am newly a professor and have a lot of students with pretty awesome stuff that they have done. And it's hard to encourage them to go directly to like a peer reviewed route. We started a journal in my department is like one way to mitigate that, but I don't know if you have any other kind of strategies or ways to encourage and amplify student writing in particular.
So I'm gonna throw it over to Will, but one thing I think that's really cool that Will does with the Active History Review is make sure that it's used as a platform to raise undergraduate voices, which is actually the next issue we're running. If you want to jump on that.
Yeah, I just sent out the call to a bunch of my students. So
Nice. Cool. Yeah. And so that was sort of stole my answer, Zane. But we do try to amplify student voices. I taught high school a few years ago, and we actually published some of my high school students' essays about what it was like to live in Baton Rouge during the Alton Sterling protests and police violence again. That meant a lot to me because they were my students, but I think that also meant a lot to a lot of readers because they got a perspective that they really don't normally get in those kinds of spaces, in those kinds of circles. And I think that's really important. The other piece of advice, I would give, I guess, is just to have students, sort of write together, with similar interests, and then sort of try to maybe pitch a project somewhere. I think there really is sort of a strength in numbers, thing that works there. But also I find that students, they sort of learn well together and improve each other's writing, right? And so, there really is a lot of, sort of a positive feedback loop there, I guess, that makes it easier for them to get published in those kinds of settings.
I think adding to that also, I know it's sometimes very difficult, but co-authoring with your students, right? I think especially we're always learning from undergraduates, just like we're trying to teach them. And so I've collaborated with different folks, obviously in undergrad, and it's been really great for me personally to work with them. And then especially using, I know giving someone like first authorship, especially if they come from like a marginalized background, and then using like my background, understanding kind of how academia works and kind of what to throw in there for punch words, I think is a good use of praxis and community building.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions from folks? Okay. Well, I will ask a question that came up then last week. And I wonder if you guys would have perspectives on it, because I promised I'd ask you. Actually, is this a question in? Oh, this is the student journal from Sarah Maria that she's put in chat. That's fantastic. Cool. I was going to say a question that came up last week is about access to resources. And a lot of people who are finding that their libraries are closed and they can't get access to things. And on the flip side, people are putting out a lot of free resources and a lot of things that are just being thrown. And I guess as I'm talking, I also want to ask you about source evaluation and people using like first-person testimonies and accounts and things to back up their writing. How are you seeing people navigate the problem of sourcing and resourcing and access to materials, especially now that most people are shut inside and books are expensive?
I'll go ahead and jump on that first. I am a little bit pessimistic. I think that's something I found with my friends, especially those who are like in their first or second year of a PhD, or especially in getting into archives, is so important, that I've had folks drop out of my collections because they no longer have access to those archives and couldn't keep working on their dissertation the way it was and didn't feel comfortable working on a chapter without having access to that. And so I think especially when you're in an institution, and if you are like a history major or work a little bit in the humanities, it is very difficult. But even for me, having access to a printer, right? Something so simple as I would go to the library and print something off to edit, and then no longer having that was very difficult. One of the reasons I couldn't write or edit for about a month, because I couldn't figure out how to navigate that, as small as it seems. And then like you were saying, just access to like primary sources, secondary sources is very difficult. I'm working on a chapter right now, and the editor really kind of wants all of their books to be cited because they're one of the main folks who works on eco-ability, but all their books are $60, right? And and if you don't cite them, then you might not be able to have the right framework to have your work accepted in the anthology. And so I think it's something we're all trying to navigate. And one thing is people putting up all these great free resources. I mean, a lot of different publishers like Duke had their 50% off sale. I threw a lot of money down on that. I was very excited. Right now, places like PM Press have 40% off on works about Black intellectual thought and Black liberation work, which I think is really great. A lot of folks are sharing syllabi on framing the uprisings, giving free PDFs of Black feminist thought and queer color critique. And so I think that is really empowering to me in a time where there's a lot of obstacles to writing and engaging and community building.
Yeah, and I'll sort of, I guess, add to that more from the like instructor side, since that I'm teaching a class right now. It's a graduate seminar, Race and Capitalism in the U.S., which is like the time to be teaching that. So I made sure that all of the the works that we're reading together and discussing are all online through the library digitally, right? So they can access that for free because they pay the tuition. So it's not really for free, right? I didn't say that, right? But the other thing is that I wanted to make sure that they had some kind of primary resource to work with, because I think that's important. And in a graduate seminar, you're supposed to write like about a 20-ish page paper, and so I wound up finding a collection of newspapers that they could use that was related to race and capitalism theme, and had them sort of approach it through their discipline. But it's been difficult. As I was wrapping up in the spring semester, before we left campus, students had an assignment that required library usage, and I essentially just kind of took that requirement away. It's like you just figure out how to make it work, and I think one or two students change their topics, but it really, I think it is on professors to make sure that students either have access or that we are understanding and flexible, and make sure that, students who don't have cash, don't have resources or whatever, don't, take a hit or a lower grade or something just because they don't have that capital. And also, if you need some kind of book for your work, Zane, you know where to find me, and I do have library privileges, and there are many PDFs on there. I know they could find their way to your inbox. I don't know, yes, let's see. But I find a lot of people.
Remind you, you're being recorded right now.
I know. Well, I just, they would fall into the inbox, right? It wouldn't be, I would never, right? So obviously I will download those for free and send them to you, right? Just to be clear, and I see that on Twitter a bit, like scholars will say, gosh, like I'm finishing up my dissertation, I'm trying to write a book review section, the lit review section, and I don't have any literature at all, help, right? And so like there's sort of informal networks that come together around this because we all have access to different stuff, because libraries and universities are arbitrary and absurd in how they handle that. But we work together to make it happen, because writing is really a collective endeavor. And I'll be quiet.
All right, and I see we have a PDF resource that Samaria shared. Fantastic, thank you for that. I will post it probably in the Facebook group for people. Let's take that away. Actually, I was curious about this because often in the humanities we're told to write solo. And in academia, we often get told to write solo. And almost every project you've mentioned, I believe, is collaborative or co-authored. So what has driven you towards that? And has that had its, like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that approach?
Yeah, I'll go. Okay, do you want to go, Will?
No, please go ahead.
This is my thing. So something I talk about a lot, and why I was so excited about the Activist History Review and being part of it and being part of the editorial board, is that I think what we learn, especially as historians, really does push activism, right? And I think because I was a history BA, and so one of the things that really was important to me are oral histories and archiving voices and figuring out what voices and what kinds of history were told, and then which ones were eclipsed and erased and ignored. And that's a very political project, right? And so I think one of why I really go into activist scholarship, because all this I do is free labor. I work about 40 hours a week, and then I do about 20 hours free labor on these projects, is that I think activist history is in itself a form of community building, and just archiving is activist work. And so the projects I do are all anthologies because I kind of know how to get published, and I really want to uplift the work of queer folks, of trans folks, of Black, Brown, Indigenous people who have really been written out of history. And that is not accidental. That is a political, like I said, a political project. And so that's why I do the anthologies that I work on. And then when I write chapters, I see academia as also, I work with my friends, right? And so these are things that I really enjoy doing and I think are important in the way I view world building. And so when I get to work with someone on a chapter, it is a kind of a gift of friendship for me. And it's a form of organizing and community building. And that's why I want to do this work. Everything I do is with that in mind. When I do book reviews, it's to get a free book, right? Because I don't want to pay for the $60 book. So that's why I do that form of labor for free. But when I'm doing chapters, I think the work I'm writing is important, but I also think the act of writing is important as well.
Yeah, I sort of tipped my hand earlier in that, like, I don't believe any writing is individual ever. But I also encourage collaborative work, on top of that, more overtly collaborative work. And so I do need to plug this very important piece that Zane and I co-authored together, a review of Frozen 2 through an anti-imperial lens. And I have to say, it was quite good. Got teary-eyed a couple times. It was excellent. It was an excellent project. But we all have different disciplinary strengths. We all have different backgrounds. I copy edited one of your pieces, Fen, and enjoyed it considerably because I learned so much. I knew almost nothing of the dance world and felt like I got a whole lot out of that, right? And it made me think about new things, which is really exciting. And to me, like, that's what writing is about, right? Learning new things, then communicating those things to other people who will then learn new things and then apply them to the world, right? It's contagious. And addictive, I think. And anyway, in conclusion, all writing is collaborative. So just, be upfront about it and collaborate. It's cool.
Yeah, even on the pieces, like every piece obviously has a ton of voices in it because editing is a form of dialogue with the author or authors. And so one reason, again, I'm so thankful to know Will and have worked at the Activist History Review is when I started, I had just gotten my first chapter accepted ever. And I obviously didn't really know how to navigate anything. I never really gotten published before that. And so it was because of Will and his mentorship, as well as mentorship all over academia, that I was really able to learn and grow and kind of be where I am right now. And then all the pieces I've written, I've been lucky enough to have folks from the Access History Review or my other friends and scholars and collaborators really view and help me edit and help me grow. And I think that's something we all do if we are really strong writers. And it's kind of our way of giving back also. That I like, when I know someone is working on something, I want to read it. I want to help them edit it. You know, I want to engage with it. And it really helps them build as well as help me build my work.
Co-author.
It just makes me so sad that so many PhD dissertations have to be written as one-person projects.
And it's such a shame, and it's so misleading. I was part of a wonderful writing group when I was finishing up, and they had an enormous impact, on my work. And they, I obviously acknowledge them in the acknowledgements, right? But that degree doesn't count for them, and that's kind of weird to me, because and I put in that labor for them too, right? And I just, the work is collaborative, and I think we should just maybe be a little bit more honest about that.
Great. I think that's a wonderful place to be. What I'd like to do now, unless people have questions that they would like to add, I'd like to invite people to all unmute themselves and imagine we've gone to the bar after the panel and have a little time just
I did actually have a question.
Please, go ahead.
So you were both discussing earlier the fact that academic writing in particular is it's a very gated thing. I mean, even I lost my student account when I graduated. I lost access to all these different academic resources I was used to having. I guess, what do you guys see as a solution to this problem of, I mean, is it more of like an open, I don't know what the academic equivalent, but like, what do you see as the way of making this stuff more accessible to those outside of academia?
Can I take that first, Will? So I was in this wonderful class in my undergraduate on the Commons, and how universities originally had these great green common spaces, right? And that people would come and talk, and they would be kind of a salon. And you can also think of the Commons as just a space where you kind of give and barter both material goods and intellectual thought. And so there's this great anthology on the Commons that I'll try to share in the chat. But what they did when they published it is they posted the whole book online to make it as accessible as possible. So for those folks who could afford it, they could actually buy the physical book, or could go ahead and try to just pay off the publishing costs. But it's there, and it still is for everyone to gain access to. And I think really having intellectual thought as a free domain, as a form of commons, is very important. And I think, I have so many criticisms of the ivory tower, the quote unquote ivory tower, right? Which is one reason why I'm not in academia. I find a lot of freedom as an independent scholar. I was talking to my one friend, and I'm in the steering committee, and they didn't want, I've really fought hard for a statement for the Appalachian Studies Association for saying Black Lives Matter. And it was like a 3-day fight, and it should not have been, right? And especially because the statement you see is nowhere where I wanted it to be, but it's so much better than they wanted to be. They're very lucky to have me, is what I'm saying. But the one person, some of the people were saying very tone deaf things. And so I'm like, my friend Jessica, I'm like, this person's in your book on like indigenous thought, and she's saying this, like, can't you just cut her out? Like, we should, because one of the things I can do is I can drop people, right, who are problematic, and choose not to cite people. And so as an independent scholar, that's one of the freedoms I have. But going back to your question, so I would say really in general, I don't really believe inherently in academia. I found it extremely exclusionary. And I don't have the answers of how to fix that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, if you find out, let me know. Um, that would be great. Yeah, I love the idea of the commons, and I started out doing like sort of medieval work where the commons is super important, and is like a physical land strip, that everyone survives off of, and that's great. And definitely, like, I think higher education should be that, right? That should be sort of like, if we're in a knowledge-based economy or whatever, or if we're even just working towards a better and more equitable future, like, we need access to ways of bringing that into being. But like practically, libraries should and institutions should absolutely give you access as a graduate. Um, and as far as I know, it costs them nothing to do that. I'm still, I still have access through my undergraduate institution, but they're the only institution that I've interacted with that has that policy, I guess. But I mean, that's to me a very basic thing that I think all institutions really should look at how to implement. Because we should, at minimum, all have access to the resources that we've kind of paid for, right? Maybe we shouldn't also like have to like pay so much for them, but that's a whole nother thing. But like I don't think it costs them anything. Like you just log in, right? That's not fair. So I don't know. I would change that.
All right. Any final questions? Folks who joined us later. No, all right. In which case, I'm going to turn the recordings off, and I hope people will stay and introduce themselves and maybe like talk a little more casually for a bit. Thank you very much, so much again to Zane and Will for being here and responding so generously and giving us your time. This has been really fabulous.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Fen.